Chapter 6, Stairway to the Emerald Isle. That afternoon, the four kids met under the oak tree. I wonder why Miss Jeepers acted so strange when we told her about Mr. O'Grady, Melody asked. Maybe he's her long-lost husband, Liza said wistfully, but she acted scared, Eddie reminded them. Maybe her long-lost husband is an axe murderer, Melody giggled nervously. Miss Jeepers said her husband was dead, Howie pointed out. Maybe Mr. O'Grady's with the Irish CIA, Melody suggested. Mrs. Jeepers might be an international jewel thief. Maybe Mr. O'Grady's really is a leprechaun, Liza said. You know Miss Jeepers doesn't like them. Why don't you guys come home with me for a few minutes, Howie suggested. My grandmother knows all about Ireland. I'm sure she can tell us about leprechauns. She'll know why Miss Jeepers is afraid of them. I guess it'd be okay, just for a minute, Melody said. Everyone else nodded and headed toward Howie's house. It didn't take long for the four friends to walk the 3 blocks. They dumped their book bags in the front hall and found Howie's grandmother in the family room reading the newspaper. Her curly hair danced around her head and her eyes sparkled like blue sapphires. Well, Howie, his grandmother smiled and put down her newspaper. You look to be bringing half the school home with you. Howie introduced Melody, Liza, and Eddie. He was barely finished when Eddie blurted, We need to know about leprechauns. Howie's grandmother's smile faded, but just for a moment. So St. Patrick's Day has you a-wondering about the little fairy folk. 'Tis a good thing to talk about on this fine day. His grandmother's voice tinkled with the same accent as Mr. O'Grady's. Treat yourself to some cookies, and I'll be a-telling you some leprechaun tales. The kids helped themselves to a handful of cookies from the kitchen and then settled down to listen. Once upon a time in Ireland, Harry's grandmother began. No, Grandma, Howie interrupted. We still have the true story of leprechauns. Melody nodded. Our teacher wouldn't tell us a thing. Miss Jeepers acted very strange today, Howie explained. She's from Romania, and she won't even talk about leprechauns. Howie's grandmother frowned. Saints preserve us, she said quietly. Leprechauns are a most peculiar fairy folk. Most people don't know the true history of their race, but they're just cute little men who wear green and hide pots of gold at the end of rainbows, Liza said. Ah, truth is, a rainbow doesn't lead only to a pot of gold, Howie's grandmother whispered. A rainbow is also a leprechaun's stairway to the Emerald Isle. What's the Emerald Isle? Melody asked. 'Tis another name for Ireland, Howie's grandmother explained. Settle back and I'll be a-telling you the true story of the wee folk. The 4 kids sat on the floor and peered up at the old woman. She spoke so quietly they had to lean in forward to hear. Chapter 7, The True Story of the Wee Folk. Long ago, leprechauns could be found throughout the world, Howie's grandmother began. The leprechaun emperor ruled the lands by possession of the stolen fairy stone. There are many kinds of magic stones, red, blue, and even purple, but the most powerful one of all is the fairy stone. It holds a strong magic. The stone does, so powerful that the leprechauns became a nuisance with it. They traveled the world, tricking anyone they could. What was the stone like, Melody asked. The fairy stone is as green as the grass underfoot and the trees overhead, and the leprechauns were proud to have it. The emperor wore it at the throat of his scarlet robe. This is sounding familiar. Scarlet, Eddie nearly shouted. But that's red. Everyone knows leprechauns wear green. Howie's mother shook her head. Not in those long ago times. They only began to wear green when they went into hiding. Why did they go into hiding? Howie asked. 'Twas the fault of the vampires. The vampires? All 4 kids yelled at once. Aye, Howie's grandmother nodded seriously. The vampires grew tired of the leprechauns' tricky ways, so they decided to get the fairy stone away from the wee folk. What happened? Melody asked. How did the vampires get the fairy stone from the leprechauns? They were tricked, Howie's grandmother exclaimed. The vampires sent a spy to live in the emperor's castle. The spy gained their trust and then sneaked into the emperor's bedroom. taking a fairy stone whilst he slept. But that's stealing, Liza cried. Howie's grandmother shook her head. The truth of the matter is that the fairy stone rightfully belonged to the vampires, and once they got it back, the vampires banished all leprechauns to the Emerald Isle. 'Tis then that the leprechauns began to wear green and hide amongst the trees and bushes. Some say it was because of shame, and to this day most leprechauns of Ireland are too ashamed to look at you. Some say you can control a leprechaun if you get him to look in your eyes. But didn't the leprechauns try to get the stone back? Eddie asked. Aye, and they're still a-trying to this day, Howie's grandmother said, but it's only 3 days that the leprechauns can be a-missing from the Emerald Isle. 1 day for each leaflet of the shamrock. The vampires saw fit to punish them that way. Was it Count Dracula who got the stone back for the vampires? Eddie asked. Who is that emperor? Is that who the emperor trusted? Howie's grandmother looked at each one of them, and then she answered in a whisper. 'Twas a teacher that tricked the emperor, the teacher of his very own children. The children were silent as they left the room. Out of the front porch, Howie whispered, That's it. What? Eddie asked. Didn't you hear what my grandmother said? A vampire who just happens to be a teacher stole the fairy stone from the leprechauns. So, Melody shrugged. So the vampire teacher is Miss Jeepers, Howie exclaimed, and she stole the fairy stone. You know that weird green brooch she always wears? That's the magic stone, and I bet those stones in Mr. O'Grady's pouch are magic too. I don't know that, Melody insisted. We don't even know Miss Jeepers is a vampire. It does sort of fit together, Liza said thoughtfully. Of course it does, Howie nodded his head, and that means Mr. O'Grady really is a leprechaun, and he's come to get the stone back. That's just a fairy tale, Eddie disagreed. It's a bunch of blarney. You won't think so if we have a leprechaun and a vampire war right in the halls of Bailey Elementary, Howie said seriously. All the kids were silent as they thought about what he said. That's true, Melody whispered. We've got to do something to stop it. But what can we do, Howie asked. We're just a bunch of kids. Maybe we should tell our parents, Liza suggested. Nobody would believe us, Melody said. They'd think we'd gone completely bonkers. We've got to think of something, Howie said, before it's too late. I know what I'm going to do, Eddie interrupted. I'll prove Mr. O'Grady isn't a leprechaun. Let's see.